Hello and welcome to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. My name is Andrew McKeever. I'm the news director here at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Today is Monday, July 22nd, and it's also a great pleasure to be joined here in the studio by Dr. Edward Cameron, who is a climate change analyst and consultant who has lengthy experience over the past 20 years or so with a variety of international organizations and institutions dealing with the subject of climate change, one that is obviously much in the news today, and we are all got a firsthand feeling about from last weekend when the weather sort of tipped into the high 90s there. Dr. Cameron, welcome to GNAT.
Thank you for having me.
Great pleasure to have you here with us today to talk about this very important subject, and coming right on the heels of the Solar Fest yesterday, just up the road at the Earth Sky Time Farm here, where you were the keynote speaker for that event. So I was thinking, just to get us started on this subject, there is still at this point a certain number of people who kind of hear the term climate change and the word hoax comes rapidly to mind, that they're very skeptical about the scientific evidence of that. The term denier comes into play. And I guess, what would you say to those folks? I mean, is there any doubt in your mind that climate change is an absolute reality? The concrete scientific evidence is all there, and no, there really isn't any grounds for skepticism.
So let me unravel that question slightly. There is absolutely no doubt in the science that climate change is real, that it is caused by human activity, notably our use of energy, our use of land, our transportation habits, the way in which we organize our lives around urban centers, our processes of industrialization, our production and consumer patterns. There's also no doubt that the process is accelerating. The more climate change we create, the more greenhouse gases we put into the atmosphere, the more the effect of climate change is actually speeding up and having devastating consequences. And there's also no doubt, of course, that we can solve this problem if we get busy on it. All of the innovations, all of the finance, all of the technology is in place for us to not only manage this risk, but to build a better world through the action we will take over the course of the next 15 years. That evidence is built upon decades of science, in fact, over a century and a half of science. The science of global warming goes back to the early 19th century. And the noted pollster and author, Nate Silver, has said that climate change is not rocket science because it predates rockets. So there is absolutely no doubt in the peer-reviewed published science on this issue that it is real. Similarly, there is no doubt in the politics of this, because 196 countries around the world have signed up to the Paris Agreement. And this includes every political philosophy known to mankind. It includes the communists of China. It includes the socialists of France. It includes the conservatives of the UK and the Christian Democrats of Germany. It includes the theocrats of Iran and the revolutionaries of Venezuela. So irrespective of where you sit on the political spectrum, there is a consensus on this issue. There is a consensus within faith-based organizations. The Pope famously issued an encyclical a couple of years ago talking about the need for Christians around the world to care for their common home, and other faith groups have done the same. So whether you're looking at the science, the politics, faith-based organization, civil society actors, whether you're looking within the medical sciences, the economics, whether you're looking in engineering or law, the consensus on this issue is real, it's robust, and it strengthens each time we conduct assessments. Now, what I would say, however, is that I do have some empathy for those people who continue to be skeptical. And the reason for that is because I tend to divide those who might not yet be converted to this cause into a number of categories. The first category I called the uninformed. There are people out there who simply have not been reached. And in part, that's because people in my community, the climate community, have done a very poor job of communicating the issue. Sometimes we speak in jargon. Sometimes we use language that is inaccessible. Sometimes we publish reports that are very heavy on the science, but not very easy for the layperson to understand. Sometimes we only speak to ourselves and we don't try to reach out to those beyond our community. So for those people who are uninformed, people like me need to do a much better job in communicating. We need to also speak about climate change in a way that resonates with the interests and motivations and incentives of ordinary people. So while it is great for us to talk about polar bears and ice caps, we need to do more to talk about jobs and economic development and health and why climate change affects real people and how a climate compatible future will be a better future for people. There's a second category of people who I call misinformed. And they're people who are getting their news from the wrong sources. And those particular sources are misleading by providing this false equivalency, this notion that the science is disputed. They may put two talking heads on a television station, for example, and give the impression that this is two scientists arguing with each other over unsettled evidence. Those people also need outreach. Those people need to be given a clearer understanding of what the real science says. Then there's a third category of those who are vested in a high carbon economy. Those are people in the oil and gas sector, for example. Those are people in the chemical sector who really fear what the future looks like if we begin to decarbonize. And then there's a final category of people who I have considerably less time for, and they're the people who are deliberately misleading. Some of those people are in our politics. Some of those people are captains of industry. They know that the science is robust. They know that climate change is a clear and present danger. They know that a better future awaits if we tackle this issue. But because of political calculus, because of the need to mobilize a base, because of a need to remain prominent in certain industrial sectors, they propagate the myth that the science isn't settled. And those people actually do not need outreach. Those people need to be defeated, and defeated ideally within our electoral system.
Well, that whole point of how to reach out to folks who may not be as convinced of the reality and the need to do something, relatively quickly about climate change is one I definitely want to return to. But I guess I just wondered, what do you see as the most immediate danger that the world faces if we sort of continue going about it as we are, which is sort of seems like growing concern, growing consensus that yes, this is a problem, but it seems like some of the tangible actions that are taking place are, well, not equal to the severity of the projected problem. I mean, islands in the Pacific Ocean seem to be threatened by rising sea levels and may disappear. Or even countries like Bangladesh are kind of in danger of seeing coastlines overwhelmed by rising sea levels. I mean, what should we be doing?
Well, the problem itself is pretty straightforward. The problem is that greenhouse gas pollution from energy and transport and land use changes the chemical composition of the atmosphere. That in turn leads to rising global mean temperatures, and we're currently above 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And without sufficient action over the course of the next decades, we will breach maybe 3 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. Once that global warming takes place, there's a series of knock-on effects within the global system. So sea level rise is one, but there are others. There's the increase in intensity of extreme weather events like hurricanes and cyclones. There's the changes in the distribution of water, so that those places susceptible to drought experience more droughts. Those places susceptible to flooding experience more flooding. There's the change in the fertility of soils and their ability to carry crops. That in turn has an effect on food security. 4 of the staple crops that we depend upon for food security around the world cannot grow at 4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. They're wheat and maize and rice and corn. So there's a whole series of things that begin to happen that affect different parts of the globe. Now, if you look, for example, at the last 18 months, you see right across the global map those scenarios playing out. You see the wildfires of California. You see the massive flooding within the Midwest affecting farming communities right across the Midwest. You see the rise in vector-borne diseases in places like New England, such as tick-borne diseases and, of course, Lyme disease. You see the most costly Atlantic hurricane season on record in 2017, which caused almost $300 billion of damage right across the eastern seaboard and tragically led to the loss of 3,000 US citizens in Puerto Rico. You see record temperatures in places like Europe and North Africa. You see a country like Mozambique, which is already extremely fragile, does not have the same level of prosperity and economic development that we enjoy, suffering 2 cyclones within the space of 1 month at the beginning of this year. And you see record floods in a place like Kerala in India. So right across the globe, irrespective of whether you're Northern Hemisphere or Southern Hemisphere, irrespective as to whether you're industrialized or developing, you see these impacts writ large right in front of our very eyes, which means this is no longer the problem of a science book. This is no longer tomorrow's crisis. This is something that we face today and is something that we must manage immediately. And the way in which we manage that is by changing, for example, our energy system. We must use less energy and we must use a different type of energy. We must segue from fossil fuels to renewables. We must change our transportation and mobility patterns. We must get away from gas-guzzling SUVs and switch to hybrids or electric vehicles, ideally to public transportation, ideally to less forms of transportation if we possibly can. We must change the diets that we have, eat less food. There's an enormous amount of food waste, for example, in the United States, and also eat far less meat than we currently do, particularly beef. I always tell my audiences, if beef was a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. So we can change our diet, we can change our mobility patterns, we can change our energy patterns. There's all sorts of things that we do that individually might not seem like a large contribution, but cumulatively, if we all begin to act in this way, and if we see systems change in these sectors, then it has a massive impact and we can begin to build that better world.
Well, how much time do you think we have before some of these changes become irreversible or have long-term effects? I mean, are we talking 10 years, 20 years? When this subject sort of first began to kind of penetrate into a lot of the public dialogue, it kind of seemed like this was a problem that was going to really get severe sometime in the second half of the 21st century, or maybe even farther down the road than that. But now it seems like I'm hearing more like 10 years or 15 years where we're going to see irreversible changes occurring unless something somewhat along with the radical changes that you just described there take place.
I think we're already seeing some changes that might prove to be irreversible. So, for example, the coral reef systems around the globe are bleaching as a consequence not only of climate change, but other forms of pollution and the extraction of materials and overfishing and so on. So we're already seeing those coral reefs being severely affected. That's extremely important because they're home to 25% of all marine life. And in the case of a country that I used to work for, the Maldives, it's very important because 50% of their economy is dependent on coral reef systems. You have the tourists who come to swim at the coral reefs, and you have the tuna fish that come to feed at the coral reefs. So we're already seeing changes that are going to be very, very difficult to manage. For me, the real issue we have going forward is, can we avoid unmanageable climate change, the type of climate change that will see Bangladesh inundated with water, and we'll see 50 million people looking for a new safe haven, possibly in a place like India, which has a history of intercommunal violence between Hindu and Muslim populations.
Probably not eager to welcome them.
Probably not eager to welcome them. So can we avoid unmanageable climate change as a consequence of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions? But similarly, and in tandem, can we manage unavoidable climate change? Because there are, unfortunately, changes that are already happening, future changes that are locked into the system as a consequence of all the pollution we've created since the dawn of the industrial age. So as we tackle this issue, it's important that we reduce our emissions, but it's also important that we now put in place mechanisms that allow for social and human systems to be resilient, but also that allow for ecological systems to be resilient as well. And that's why in the work that I do with companies and governments, I always advocate for a balanced approach to this issue, where we avoid risk and we manage the risk that's already there.
You were one of the people who was involved in constructing the Paris Climate Accord agreement that the U.S. was a party to until recently. We're now no longer involved in that. How damaging or how much of a slowdown will there be as a result of that action? I mean, let's assume that at some point in the next 4 or 5 years, the U.S. opts to return as a full party to that. Is that going to be a real problem to kind of regain the momentum that might have been developing in the beginning?
The first thing I would say is that the United States has a history of engagement and disengagement in what we have seen over the last 25 years through the UN process. Early on in the process, the US was very heavily engaged and is often considered, for example, to be the parent that abandoned the Kyoto Protocol, because it was diplomats within the US government who wrote the provisions of the Kyoto Protocol before President Clinton decided that he simply couldn't get it through the Senate. Then there was a period of about 8 years when the Bush administration was very hostile on this issue, but not hostile to the point of abandoning the process, more slow walking the process. And then we saw over the 8 years of the Obama administration a great deal of leadership from the federal government, to the extent that the Paris Agreement, although signed by 196 countries, was essentially drafted in Beijing and in Washington. And I was told over many occasions that not only was it the number one area of bilateral cooperation between the Chinese and the United States, but it was the area of the most significant progress. So I often tell people that the Paris Agreement was made in the USA. And that is very positive because it means that the architecture of the Paris Agreement is very robust, the provisions are very strong, there's a great deal of ambition in it, but it's also part of the tragedy because to walk away from something that you yourself has created is problematic. Now, in terms of its long-term consequences, the moment that the United States decided to announce its intention to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, the rest of the world stood up in unison and said, we intend to go on. We intend to stay the course on this issue. They didn't have to make that statement. That coalition could easily have fallen apart, and those countries who have a lot to lose from transitioning to a low-carbon future could easily have used US withdrawal as cover to pull out themselves. They haven't done that. I therefore suspect that there will come a time when the US will rejoin the consensus and will continue with domestic policies at the federal level that honor the Paris Agreement and its spirit. I would also say it's very important to look at what's happening in the real economy in the United States. And in the real economy, there are major American multinational companies who are taking very ambitious commitments on climate change, and in many cases are within the vanguard in their own industrial sectors on this issue. There are states right across the union who are leading on this issue. It's very fortunate that California has a very difficult vehicle emission standard to the federal government, and it's very, very fortunate that states, including Vermont, are joining that California standard rather than reversing to the Trump standard, which is going to be not only bad for the environment, it's going to be bad for public health, it's going to be bad for the automotive sector, it's going to slow down innovation and finance within that sector. It's probably going to lead to many more foreign cars being sold in the United States because American cars simply won't be competitive with them. So there's a lot of innovation and leadership at the state level. There's a lot of leadership at the city and town level. And as a consequence, I think probably some of the worst instincts of the federal government as they are today might actually be balanced out by some of the wonderful innovation and leadership right across the country.
One of the interesting points you made in a talk you gave recently down in Arlington on the subject was that the private sector is also one of the leaders in this effort, that even within the energy sector, the petroleum industry, and certainly beyond that, there are industry leaders who are realizing what's going on and adapting their businesses accordingly, which was, I guess, somewhat surprising to me. But you see much evidence that suggests that the private sector is getting it and saying, hey, if we want to be a viable business 10, 15, 20 years down the road, we need to be changing now.
They are getting it, and why they're getting it is important. They're getting it because they understand risk and reward. So a multinational company, take for example a company in the food, beverage and agriculture sector, they understand that their operations are threatened by climate change. They understand that the natural resources they depend upon, perhaps it's Coca-Cola depending on water and sugar, those natural resources are threatened by climate change. They understand that their finances are threatened. Famously in 2012, when Superstorm Sandy hit New York, Verizon lost $1 billion because their infrastructure was not climate-proof. They were using copper wire cabling, which disintegrates in salt water. Their competitors were using fiber optic cabling. Companies are aware of reputational risk. They're aware of the fact that if they're not seen to be leading on climate change, they may lose customers and they may lose investors. They may lose workers because increasingly millennials want to go and work for a company that has a purpose and a sense of mission and the right values. So right across the different categories of risk that companies understand better than anyone else and that are baked into enterprise risk management systems, they now see climate change as the number one material risk to their viability. But similarly, they see rewards. They understand that if they now begin to make their supply chains resilient, they can have competitive advantage because of that. They begin to see that an increasing amount of venture capital and other forms of finance are flowing into a new economy that requires new innovations, new goods, new products, new services. So they see this new economy that we're creating as something that they can use to enhance profitability. So the motivation is very important because they're not doing this from some sense of altruism or philanthropy. They're doing this because of hard-edged decisions being taken by CEOs and CFOs. When you then look at the volume of leadership, you see that around the world, as we speak, 6,000 companies who together represent $36 trillion, that's half the global economy, have made one or more climate commitments. This includes commitments to purchase all of their energy from renewable sources. It includes commitments to have electric vehicle fleets. It includes a commitment to have and advocate for carbon pricing. It includes commitments to take on board science-based targets right across their supply chains. This, in my view, is the most optimistic story that I've seen in 22 years working on climate change, because when I started my career on this issue, a company was neutral or hostile to anything that I was trying to achieve. And I think over the last 5 years, they've possibly become the most important ally in the mission. And going back to your first question, it's very hard for someone to consider climate change a hoax if they see the captains of industry and companies across 10 industrial sectors, companies from 120 different countries, acting on this issue when it's not immediately obvious that they should be. Why would BP act on this issue? Why would Exxon act on this issue if it was all a hoax?
All right. Well, what do you see the future lying ahead for companies like Exxon and the other petroleum companies? I mean, is the end game here that they just go out of business because we can't burn oil anymore, and therefore we have to leave whatever is left in the ground or under the ocean? Or do they transition themselves into renewable energy companies that install solar panels or windmills? I mean, is there any sense that they're saying, okay, we can maybe do this for a little while longer, but by the time we get to 2050, we're out of the oil business?
We will always need energy. And we will need more energy given that we have not only a growing global population. When I was born in 1975, we had 3 billion people on the planet. By 2050, we will have 10 billion people on the planet. We also have a growing global middle class, which means, particularly in the global south, people who previously would not have had computers and handheld devices and refrigeration, they now have access to these things. People who didn't previously take international flights are now taking international flights. There is now a massive market for cruise ship holidays in China, for example. Education is linked to energy because it's very difficult for you to have your schooling and do your homework if you don't have access to lighting, for example. So we will always need energy. The question facing us and these companies is, what will that energy look like? So if you're a company like Exxon and you've decided that you're simply going to double down on fossil fuels, then your profitability, I think, is threatened. I think from a regulatory standpoint, you are threatened. Increasingly, I think from a compliance and legal standpoint, you are threatened. There is now a court case in New York State where the Attorney General of New York is bringing legal procedures against Exxon for failing to disclose what it knew about climate change in the late 1970s. So if you want to stay wedded to fossil fuels, my message to you is that your time is limited. However, why not simply become a different form of energy company? And why not embrace the fact that we will always need energy, just a different type of energy? And for example, that's what's happening in China. China is now home to the 5 largest renewable energy companies in the world. They're creating millions of jobs in that sector. They understand that they're on the cusp of becoming the 21st century energy superpower. Why don't we follow that model as opposed to trying to cling to being a 19th century energy superpower? This transition makes economic sense, and it can be a transition that is of benefit to the incumbent energy companies if they change their business models, and if they don't, there are plenty of insurgent energy companies that are willing to take their place.
And the other aspect of this, which certainly came up a lot, I think, in the 2016 presidential election here in the U.S., is the jobs question. I mean, obviously, solar industry and the wind industry, other folks who are involved in renewable fuels have seen an expansion of job opportunities for a lot of folks to install solar panels and the thought. But the big issue, of course, is, well, what happens to coal miners? And of course, those folks felt pretty threatened. How is this all going to affect them? People like folks who've been in the coal industry all their lives, and that's what their parents did and grandparents did. How do we get those folks to kind of buy into the notion that, well, hey, I might be a coal miner now, but maybe my kid could be a computer coder or install solar panels? I mean, do we need to have some kind of program that retrains people to adapt to this new reality?
We need more than a program. We need a philosophy. And that philosophy is called the just transition. And what the just transition means is, if we spend the next 15 years removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere or limiting the amount of greenhouse gases we put up there, and we spend trillions of dollars to get to the point where we've decarbonized the atmosphere, but we still hand over a world of rampant inequality. We still hand over a world where 40% of Americans can't sustain a $400 emergency expense. We still hand over a world where 22,000 children die every day from hunger. We still hand over a world where communities around the world are suffering dislocation from globalization and deindustrialization and automation. We still hand over a world where human rights are abused, where 60 to 100 million women have disappeared. What will the effort have been for? So part of what we're trying to do on climate change, using a term called climate justice, is to make sure that we use this as an inflection point to build a better world. And that includes building a better world for all of those people who are currently employed in, invested in, dependent upon the high carbon economy. Because if you leave Appalachia behind, if you leave the oil and gas fields of the Middle East behind, if you leave parts of the world behind that are dependent on a high carbon approach to agriculture, you will not have created the better world, but you'll also see the type of populist backlash that we see in our politics right across the globe. So within all of these communities, we've actually got to go into them and tell them, we understand your hesitancy on this issue, and we're going to invest in the economic development of your towns and your cities. We're going to invest in shared prosperity. We are going to invest in human capital so that those of you working in the high carbon economy can be skilled up and trained to work in the low carbon economy. We're going to make sure that some of these companies making climate commitments relocate to your areas. So for example, if Facebook is looking for green energy in order to honor its climate commitment, why can't Facebook put its data centers into a place like West Virginia? And why can't West Virginia source livelihoods as a consequence of providing green energy to the companies of tomorrow? So I think this issue of the just transition has to be fundamental to not only our messaging, but fundamental to every policy we design. We cannot leave these communities behind. But second of all, it's important to bear in mind that these industries were in decline long before climate change came along and long before climate policies were put in place. The high watermark for coal jobs in the United States was in the late 1970s. And as of today, there are only about 50,000 jobs in coal mining in the United States. They haven't disappeared because of climate policies. They've disappeared because of automation. They've disappeared because companies no longer want to procure high carbon energy from coal. They want to procure renewable energy. So the market forces, whether it's through automation or through the decisions being made by those who consume energy, are simply moving against coal. And we've got to understand that, not abandon those communities, but recognize that reality and prepare those communities for a soft landing and then to be reschooled and re-engaged in what the new economy looks like.
One of the theories that has come out as to address what you were just talking about there was a program, falls under the expression, I believe, Green New Deal.
Yes.
Was advanced earlier this year by several politicians here. What do you make of it? Do you think that approach makes sense? I mean, it sounded like it was an attempt to marry the economic changes that will be necessary with the imperatives of going to a more renewable energy-based energy system. Do you think that what those folks are talking about makes sense and points us in the right direction, or not?
So you mentioned at the introduction that my professional career is varied, and that means that I try as much as I possibly can to bring the knowledge of climate science and marry it together with my understanding of politics. I think the Green New Deal has many strong provisions. I think the timeline identified in the Green New Deal is the appropriate one, 2030. I think the level of ambition is the appropriate one, net zero emissions. I think the equivalence between the Green New Deal and mobilization at wartime or a moon landing is the appropriate one. I think the optimism contained in the Green New Deal in terms of job creation as a narrative is important. But that being said, there are provisions in the Green New Deal, for example, around providing everyone who wants one a federally mandated job that I think are seriously problematic from a political standpoint. In the work that I do, I always say, don't give people a reason to say no, give them an opportunity to say yes. And I think the politics of the Green New Deal and the way it was crafted and the messengers behind it and some of the provisions of it make it very, very difficult for that Green New Deal to be palatable within moderate Democrats, let alone within conservative Republicans. My feeling is, in the context of the United States, we've gotten as far as we can with climate change being the sole possession, if you will, of liberal Democrats. Unless we build a societal consensus on this issue that brings in some of our more conservative friends and neighbours, then we're going to continue this cycle of boom and bust policies where you have a Democrat administration moving this agenda forward and then a Republican administration being very regressive. It doesn't have to be this way. It wasn't always this way. Theodore Roosevelt was a Republican. He created the National Park System. Richard Nixon, for all of his many faults, created the Environmental Protection Agency. George H.W. Bush actually signed the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which led to the Paris Agreement. So we've got to get back again to this issue being bipartisan, to a societal consensus, so that we can move forward collectively on this issue. I would have liked the Green New Deal to be an instrument that would enable that. And I feel it doesn't succeed because it contains too many triggers for Republicans and conservatives. And so my hope is that the next iteration of it keeps the ambition, but perhaps loses some of those triggers.
All right. How are we doing here in Vermont on this? Just to kind of get a little more local. A few years back, Vermont came out with some very ambitious energy goals for, by the time we got to 2050, we were going to be getting 90%, I believe, of our energy sources from renewable, energy use from renewable sources. My latest understanding is that we're not exactly on track to meet those ambitious goals. Is that your sense of it, or is there something more that we should be doing, or something that we could be doing that would be within the realm of, reasonable, pragmatic practicality that would get us to that 90% goal by 2050?
I think there's a lot to be said about what's going on in Vermont at the moment. So let's start with the positives. The first positive is that within Vermont, it has the lowest emissions of any state in the Union and the lowest per capita emissions of any state in the Union, all of which is a good basis to begin from. In addition, there is a track record in Vermont of taking a leadership position on this issue. All federal government action on climate change over the last 8 years has been dependent on something called Massachusetts versus EPA. And this is a very famous court case from 2007 that essentially mandates the federal government to treat greenhouse gas as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. Vermont was a co-signatory to Massachusetts versus EPA, demonstrating that the state understands that what you do within your own borders is important, but how you project power and use innovation and imagination and creativity outside the borders of the state are equally important for what we're trying to do on this issue. Similarly, recently the governor set up a climate commission. That climate commission came back with 53 recommendations. All of the recommendations, I think, are sensible. There has been a movement within the state to consider carbon pricing, a very, very sensible policy measure if properly designed. There are all manner of different draft bills being circulated amongst the State House, talking about the economics of this issue, talking about how we might invest in new infrastructure, talking about how we might mandate all of the various departments of state government to lead on this issue. The governor has recently said that rather than following the federal standard on fuel efficiency within vehicles, that he will ensure that Vermont sticks closely to the California standard on fuel efficiency. So there's a lot of good things happening that we can build upon. That being said, the governor set up the Climate Commission and only met with the commission once. That being said, the governor has not really put his shoulder behind the 53 recommendations of the Climate Commission. The governor, as a Republican, is uniquely positioned to try and build societal consensus on this issue in Vermont and nationwide. He hasn't done that. The governor has the power of the purse in the state. That doesn't just mean how he spends money on infrastructure. It also means how he might spend money on analysis of the problem. One of the common refrains I get when I speak to members of the House and Senate here is that they need the governor to help them, quote, de-risk a positive vote on this issue. And the way he can help them de-risk is by providing them with state-funded analysis that creates an evidence base that says investing in a new climate economy will help build Vermont's future. And he hasn't been willing to do that. He hasn't been willing to back many of the draft bills that are circulating around the House at the moment. Similarly, I think on the legislative side of the equation, there is a Democratic supermajority, and they haven't done nearly as much as they ought to have done with that political capital and these favourable winds behind them. I would also say that in my experience working with them, there is a lack of creativity and imagination in terms of how they go about crafting policies and laws on this issue. I think too many of them think of climate change as an energy problem that needs an energy policy. Too many of them think of climate change exclusively as a greenhouse gas issue, as opposed to building societal resilience as you reduce greenhouse gases. And too few of them are thinking about how we use this as a moment and an opportunity to tackle some of the other issues facing Vermont. So the example I always use is Quebec to our north has created a system whereby they go out to all of these companies who are making climate commitments. And they say to these companies, you now have a responsibility to your shareholders to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions. In order to do that, you need clean energy. Come and locate in our province and we will give you all the clean energy you can handle. And as a result, these companies are bringing their inward investment to Quebec, generating economic opportunity in Quebec, generating jobs in Quebec. We live in a state that has a shrinking tax base. We lose our young people, we can't retain them. We can't attract young people from other places. We have a problem of human capital. We have a problem with the pension liability. We have a problem with generating enough revenue to invest in infrastructure. Why hasn't the governor appointed a climate commissioner to go out to all of these companies and say to them, we are the clean energy state of this nation. We welcome you to our state. We want to see your job creation and investments in this state. That hasn't happened. Why hasn't the governor said 70% of our land is forested land? That land can be used as a carbon sink. That carbon sink can be traded in carbon markets to generate revenue. That revenue can be reinvested in the state, in our human capital, in low carbon infrastructure, in public transportation, in weatherization of homes. He hasn't done that. The legislature hasn't done that. So I think we've got a lot going for us in this state. We have environmental credentials in this state, but we haven't gone faster or as far as we could go. The final thing that I would say is that in my experience traveling around the state, there are enormous pockets of innovation in every locality I've gone into. Solarfest was a great illustration of that yesterday. We have people in this state who are literally world-class thought leaders on things like sustainable food systems, on regenerative agriculture, on renewable energy, on sustainable mobility. We need to be joining those people up far better than we currently do. It's a source of dismay for me that the state government often seems to stop at Route 4 and everything south of Route 4 seems to be forgotten about. But there's pockets of innovation here that really just require connectivity and an infusion in order for them to be scaled. And if we could do that, I think we would see real results very, very quickly.
One of the issues that's been around Vermont politics for a while now is this whole question of a carbon tax. It came up in the governor's re-election bid in 2018 that, it was kind of a boogeyman for a lot of folks. And the governor was quite forthright about opposing that. What do you think about a carbon tax? I mean, that always struck me as probably the most effective way to reshape energy use. If you make something more expensive, people will tend to use less of it. So, and some of the plans that have been advocated, like the Essex plan, I believe was one, which would try to redirect some of that money that was taken in to benefit folks who might be hurt by the fact that their gas might cost more. The other question I'll just add on to that is interesting discussion has come up recently around electric cars. And if we're going to increase the number of electric cars on the roads in Vermont, that also means less gas tax being collected, less money going to the state treasury that maintains roads. How do we tax electric cars appropriately and accordingly so that that money to maintain the roads and other infrastructure still is there? Should we see a gigantic increase in the number of electric cars on the roads? So it's a two-part question there. Sorry to make it more complicated than it should have been.
The first thing is that I would say that carbon pricing and carbon tax is simply one mechanism for carbon pricing. There are other mechanisms like emissions trading systems, for example. These are increasingly common instruments right around the globe. There are now about 72 different jurisdictions, national, provincial, state, municipal, right around the globe that have put in place carbon pricing mechanisms. And there are countless number of companies that have internal carbon pricing mechanisms of their own. So it is a mechanism that is becoming more and more common. The real issue with the carbon price is how you design it. Can you design it in a way that both reduces emissions and protects the most vulnerable in society? In this case, low-income populations who are heavily dependent on fuel for mobility, and not only for their own personal mobility, but often for the ability to move their goods and services that they depend upon for their livelihoods across the state. So the secret is really how you go about designing the plan. There's a third element, of course, which is, do you want to use the plan in order to raise revenues? So in some jurisdictions, they see carbon pricing as revenue neutral. In other cases, they use it as a form of taxation to bring in money that can be spent on schools or hospitals, on roads. I think that in the case of Vermont, the idea of a carbon price is the right one, but I'm not convinced I've yet seen the right design. So, for example, the Essex plan would have protected the most vulnerable populations by recycling money that they spend at the fuel station back into their wallets and purses through a rebate. My worry about that is, would it have simply become a circular financial mechanism that didn't in fact reduce greenhouse gas emissions? I wasn't convinced by the information coming out that it would indeed reduce emissions. So I think we shouldn't reject the concept because the concept is a good one. What we should do is spend much more time on the detail, figuring out how do we price it, how do we raise the revenue, making sure the social safeguards are properly in place to protect the most vulnerable. But unless it tangibly reduces greenhouse gas emissions, it is such a polarizing term that it might be better left to one side, and we might be better off spending our political capital on other policies that are less controversial but can ultimately get us to the same result. So I wouldn't say put all of our eggs in this basket. I would say design it well, make sure it's politically viable, or concentrate on other means that could work instead. When it comes to the second issue of electric vehicles, I'm a European, so I don't have the immediate knee-jerk allergic reaction to taxes that Americans have, because in the society I come from, you pay high tax, but you get free public health care and free education and the best infrastructure in the world. Over here, you don't pay high tax, you simply pay fees for everything. So you end up spending the same amount of money, but you don't get the health care and the education and the infrastructure. So I actually think the debate is a little bit of a skewed debate. I think you could have a massive rollout of electric vehicles in this state. You could put in place the right infrastructure, and whatever money you would use from the fuel tax, I'm sure there are plenty of bureaucrats in Montpelier who would be more than capable of coming up with other ways to source that revenue. Beyond the public policy, I would say that there is another systems issue related to electric vehicles that we would have to address in a Vermont context, and that is the provision of electric vehicles that have four-wheel drive. Because although infrastructure and affordability and perhaps cultural issues are part of the roadblocks that prevent people from buying electric vehicles, another roadblock is the fact that most of them only come in front-wheel drive, and many people in this state and right across New England are reluctant to have a vehicle that doesn't have four-wheel drive. So I think there's things we have to do to shape behavior with the consumer. There's a different type of policy environment that we need to put in place so that we can have more charging stations, make this more viable for longer journeys. But there's also a message that we need to convey to the private sector and the automotive industry in particular to make sure that they're building the right sorts of vehicles that we need in a state of this nature, a state that is rural and a state obviously that has mountainous and a state that has very harsh winters.
Well, one last thing before we have to go here. There's a certain apocalyptic quality about a lot of the conversation around climate change. At least it seems like that to me. Is like, you start looking at all the stuff that's going on, the weather patterns, the melting polar ice caps, the rising sea levels, and you sort of go, oh my God, this is going to be a really tough nut to crack. But you sound optimistic that there is a solution out there, or a set of solutions. Do you feel like we are going to be able to kind of rise to this challenge and over the course of the next 20 or so years, come up with at least some kind of workable solutions that will at least mitigate some of the worst case scenarios that might possibly happen?
So I want to define what it means to be an optimist, because some people think that an optimist is the type of person who says, there's no need to worry about this. I'm the type of optimist who says, we can handle this if we get busy. And the truth of the matter is we are facing a momentous challenge. But equally, we have all of the technology, all of the innovation, all of the finance, all of the knowledge across every sector, the political buy-in from every country on earth with the exception of the federal government in the United States. We have a foundation today to not only manage this risk, but to use this as an inflection point to build a better world that we didn't have even 5 years ago. So what I'm saying to people is, let's use this foundation that we have created so painstakingly. Let's accelerate the progress that we've made in government, in the private sector, in the consciousness of individuals, in the action that we take as communities, as households, as workplaces. Let's accelerate and deepen that. If we accelerate and deepen it, we will not only find that we protect the climate, we will find that we create more prosperous neighborhoods, because protecting the environment means sourcing from your local small and medium-sized enterprise. It means buying from your local bookstore rather than Amazon. It means buying from your local sustainable farmer rather than big ag. It means spending money on renewable energy where more money stays in the state rather than fossil fuels, where most of the money spent on fossil fuels leaves the state. So an investment in climate change is an investment in our neighborhood. It's an investment in public health. There are 9 million people around the world who die premature deaths every year because of airborne pollution. We can avoid those deaths as a consequence of switching to renewable energy. It's an investment in human rights, because the tragedy of all of this is that those who lack access to information, decision-making, and justice, those people who are shut out from the economy and from political processes, they're the people who are hit first and hardest by climate change. And their rights are further undermined by climate risk. So everything we need to not only solve this problem, but to build a better world, we have. The question is, are we going to have the political will and the political courage and what I would call the generational change of leadership in the private sector and in government that will enable us to do this? I feel increasingly the answer to that question is yes. So the evidence is there. But finally, my last message is, I don't meet many people who are activated by fear of the future. I find that it's enough to cause outrage, but that outrage is rarely challenged. So I always say to people when I'm speaking publicly, if I were to ask you to join me in a suicide mission for a doomed planet, your response would probably be to stay at home and watch Netflix. But if I say to you, please join me in building a better world, you might feel empowered, you might feel equipped, you might feel activated, and you might therefore contribute. And so I think the optimism is based on evidence, but it's also based on the fact that to solve this problem, we need all of us to contribute, and we can only do that with a hopeful message.
Well, much food for thought, and well, complex issue, but I hope your sense of optimism will certainly play out as we go forward on this mission here to see how we will adapt to these changing circumstances. I want to thank Dr. Edward Cameron for being with us today to walk us through some of these interesting points in this whole discussion here, and also thank you as well for being with us today. Hope you found the conversation interesting, and we'll see you again the next time. Have a great day.